W. Marvin Watson, a World War II combat veteran who ran Lyndon B. Johnson's White House with the protective instincts of a loyalist, the privileged power of a confidant and the efficiency of a drill sergeant, died on Sunday at his home in the Woodlands, Tex. He was 93. His death was confirmed by Tom Johnson, who served on the White House staff with Mr. Watson. President Johnson did not want to give any staff member the title of Chief of Staff, but he eventually made Mr. Watson his in all but name. When he arrived at the White House in 1965, Mr. Watson, a fellow Texan and proud Johnson man by his own description, had been a political ally of the president's since Johnson's successful run for the United States Senate in 1948. In 1964, Mr. Watson smoothed the way for Johnson's nomination at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, 9 months after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. But for years he had turned down entreaties to work for Johnson, even after Johnson became president. Asked early on by Johnson to join his staff, Mr. Watson declined, saying he was happy living in a small Texas town as a steel company executive. Then, in mid-November 1964, shortly after he won the presidency, Johnson surprised Mr. Watson by showing up at a dinner being held in Mr. Watson's honor. In his remarks, Johnson ladled out his famously effusive flattery. "Marvin is as wise as my father, as gentle as my mother, as loyal and dedicated, and as close to my side as Lady Bird," Johnson said, referring to the First Lady. Mr. Watson finally took the job with the nominal title of Special Assistant to the President on certain conditions, that he would have unfettered access to Johnson, an adjacent office, and the privilege of disagreeing with him frankly in meetings. As Johnson's most trusted confidant, Mr. Watson would ultimately replace Bill Moyers in that role when Mr. Moyers, the president's press secretary, left in 1967 to be publisher of the Long Island newspaper Newsday. Mr. Moyers had replaced Walter Jenkins as perhaps Johnson's closest aide after Mr. Jenkins was arrested on a morals charge in 1964, accused of engaging in homosexual behavior in a Washington YMCA. Mr. Watson now sits nearer the center of American political power than anyone except the president himself, the reporter Roy Reed wrote in a profile of him in the New York Times in 1967, though he added, "He is practically unknown." Mr. Watson proved to be a tough, exacting gatekeeper. He fired or forced the resignation of staff members who he believed were more loyal to Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Johnson's arch-rival, than the president. The speechwriter Richard N. Goodwin, a longtime Kennedy family ally, was one of them. Mr. Watson coordinated White House relations with the Democratic National Committee and Congress, personally handing checks to Democratic representatives and senators running for re-election, $2,000 for those with opponents, $1,000 for others, from funds that Johnson had raised. He was also the administration's liaison to the FBI, and the only person in the White House besides Johnson who read the agency's reports on the Reverend